The morning of June 4th, 1942 dawned with deceptive calm across the Pacific, yet beneath this serenity churned the most pivotal naval confrontation of the Second World War. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft, carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the formation of Japan's most formidable naval strike force. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cut through the azure waters like steel leviathans, their decks bristling with Zero fighters and dive bombers that had brought terror to Pearl Harbor just 6 months prior. The Japanese Empire's Pacific strategy hinged on this moment. After their stunning victories across the Pacific theater, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, the Imperial Navy sought to deliver a crushing blow to American naval power at Midway Atoll. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had conceived this operation as the decisive stroke that would force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace. The tiny coral atoll sitting strategically between Hawaii and Japan represented more than just another conquest. It was the key to Japan's Pacific dominance. According to historical accounts from the Naval War College Review, the Japanese plan was intricate, yet fatally flawed in its assumptions about American capabilities. Nagumo's carriers had launched their first wave at dawn, 108 aircraft screaming toward Midway's defenses. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the formation of Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers, escorted by Zero fighters whose rising sun emblems gleamed in the early light. The admiral watched until the aircraft became mere specks against the morning sky, then turned his attention to the radio reports crackling through the ship's communication systems. Below decks, the Akagi hummed with activity. Mechanics worked frantically to prepare the second wave of aircraft, their hands moving with practiced efficiency, born of countless drills. The hangar decks reeked of aviation fuel and hot metal, while the armories bustled with ordnance crews loading bombs and torpedoes. Every man aboard understood the magnitude of their mission. They were the spearhead of Japan's imperial ambitions, the instrument through which the empire would achieve mastery over the Pacific. Yet unknown to Nagumo and his crews, American codebreakers had shattered the Japanese naval cipher weeks earlier. At Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptanalysts had worked around the clock to decode Japanese communications, piecing together fragments of intercepted messages like a deadly jigsaw puzzle. The Americans knew the Japanese were coming, and Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned his forces accordingly. 3 American carrier task forces lay in wait northeast of Midway. The Enterprise and Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, moved through the swells with deadly purpose, while the Yorktown, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, maintained radio silence despite battle damage sustained at the Coral Sea just a month prior. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the Pacific War's trajectory, though neither side fully grasped the historical forces they were about to unleash upon the morning tide. The first bombs fell on Midway at 6:25 that morning, raining destruction upon the tiny atoll's defensive installations. Lieutenant Tominaga's bombers swept over Sand Island and Eastern Island, their ordnance cratering runways and igniting fuel stores in towering columns of black smoke. Marine defenders scrambled to their anti-aircraft guns, filling the sky with streams of tracer fire that created deadly constellations against the dawn. Captain Ramsey's radar station had detected the incoming Japanese formation while it was still miles away, giving Midway's defenders precious minutes to prepare. Every available American aircraft on the atoll, antiquated Brewster Buffaloes, obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers, and a handful of newer Dauntless dive bombers, rose to meet the Japanese onslaught. The aerial melee that followed painted the sky with contrails and debris as American pilots threw themselves against the superior Japanese aircraft with desperate courage. Major Lofton Henderson led his squadron of Marine dive bombers in a suicidal attack against the Japanese carriers, though they never reached their targets. The experienced Zero pilots, veterans of campaigns across the Pacific, methodically destroyed the attacking American aircraft. Henderson himself died in the attack, his bomber plummeting into the ocean amid a cascade of burning fuel and twisted metal. The Marine airfield that would later bear his name was already taking shape in the chaos of that morning's combat. Historical documentation from the Midway Battle Summary prepared by the Office of Naval Intelligence reveals the devastating effectiveness of Japanese air power during these initial phases. Aboard the Akagi, Nagumo received Tominaga's radio message requesting a second strike against Midway's installations. The lieutenant reported that while significant damage had been inflicted, another attack was necessary to completely neutralize the base. This request would prove to be one of history's most consequential communications, setting in motion a chain of decisions that would determine the battle's outcome. The admiral faced a critical choice. His aircraft were already being rearmed for potential strikes against American naval forces, their bombs and torpedoes being carefully loaded by ordnance crews working in the stifling heat of the hangar decks. To prepare for a second strike against Midway would require changing the ordnance configuration, a time-consuming process that would leave his carriers vulnerable. Yet Tominaga's assessment of Midway's continuing threat seemed valid. The atoll's aircraft had already launched multiple attacks against his task force. As Nagumo deliberated, American reconnaissance aircraft circled high above the Japanese formation. Lieutenant Howard 80, piloting a PBY Catalina flying boat, had spotted the enemy carriers and transmitted their position to Admiral Fletcher aboard the Yorktown. The intelligence reached Spruance and his task force commanders, who immediately began launching their own strike aircraft. The race against time had begun. While Japanese ordnance crews struggled to rearm their aircraft in the cramped confines of the carrier hangar decks, American pilots lifted off from the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led his torpedo bomber squadron into the sky, followed by dive bomber squadrons under commanders who understood they were flying toward either victory or death. The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating what would become one of naval warfare's most decisive engagements. At 9:18 that morning, the first wave of American torpedo bombers found Nagumo's carriers. 15 Douglas Devastators from the Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, approached the Japanese formation at wave-top level. These obsolete aircraft, slow and vulnerable, faced an impossible mission against the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Waldron had briefed his men that morning with characteristic bluntness. They were flying into hell, and few would return. His prescience proved tragically accurate. Zero fighters swooped down like hawks upon the lumbering torpedo bombers, their 20mm cannons tearing through aluminum fuselages with devastating effect. One by one, the Devastators fell into the Pacific's embrace, leaving oil slicks and debris to mark their sacrifice. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floated in the ocean amid the wreckage of his aircraft, hidden beneath a rubber seat cushion as the battle raged overhead. From his unique vantage point, he witnessed the unfolding drama that would change the course of the Pacific War. His squadron's destruction seemed to validate Japanese confidence in their naval supremacy, yet their sacrifice was drawing the combat air patrol down to sea level. Contemporary accounts from the Battle of Midway, as documented in the Naval Historical Center's official records, emphasize the crucial role played by these torpedo bomber attacks in setting up the decisive dive bomber strikes. High above the carnage, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise in a desperate search for the Japanese carriers. Low on fuel and with time running out, McCluskey faced the agonizing possibility of returning empty-handed while his comrades died below. Then he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward, the Arashi, which had been delayed by a submarine attack and was now hurrying to rejoin the main formation. Following the destroyer's wake like a compass needle pointing toward destiny, McCluskey's bombers crested the clouds to discover the Japanese carriers spread below them in a perfect attack formation. The four flat tops were in the midst of launching aircraft, their flight decks crowded with fueled and armed planes. It was an aviator's dream target, and Japan's nightmare made manifest. The American dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives at precisely 10:22, their aircraft screaming down through the morning air at terminal velocity. The Japanese carriers, caught in the vulnerable moment of flight operations, could not maneuver effectively to avoid the plummeting aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with deadly flowers of smoke and shrapnel, yet the American pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. Lieutenant Richard Best selected the Akagi as his target, diving his Dauntless through the defensive fire with ice-cold precision. His 1,000-pound bomb struck the carrier's flight deck and penetrated to the hangar spaces below, where aviation fuel and ordnance created a perfect recipe for catastrophe. Within minutes, the flagship of Japan's Pearl Harbor attack force was transformed into a floating inferno, her steel decks buckling under the heat of uncontrolled fires that no damage control party could contain. The destruction of the Akagi marked only the beginning of Japan's catastrophe. As Admiral Nagumo's flagship burned, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led his dive bombers from the Yorktown against the carrier Soryu. The Japanese flat top, caught with her flight deck packed with aircraft being prepared for launch, presented an irresistible target to the American aviators diving from 14,000 feet. Leslie's bomb struck the Soryu amidships, its explosion triggering a chain reaction among the armed and fueled aircraft on her deck. Within moments, the carrier was engulfed in flames that reached skyward like the fingers of some vengeful deity. Captain Yanagimoto chose to remain aboard his dying ship, standing at attention on the bridge as the flames consumed his command. His sacrifice epitomized the Bushido code that governed Japanese naval officers, yet it could not save his vessel from destruction. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the Enterprise struck the carrier Kaga with devastating effect. The massive converted battleship, pride of the Japanese fleet, absorbed multiple bomb hits that penetrated her armored deck and exploded in her aviation fuel storage compartments. The resulting conflagration turned the 26,000-ton vessel into a funeral pyre that could be seen for miles across the Pacific's blue expanse. Naval warfare historians, including those cited in Samuel Eliot Morrison's definitive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, consistently identify these coordinated dive bomber attacks as the turning point of the Pacific War. Within the span of 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers lay burning and helpless. The morning that had begun with such promise for the Empire now witnessed the systematic destruction of naval aviation assets that had taken years to develop and could never be adequately replaced. The experienced pilots who perished in the flames represented an even greater loss. Japan's pool of veteran naval aviators was finite, and each death reduced the Empire's ability to project power across the Pacific. Captain Tomeo Kaku of the Kaga made a desperate attempt to save his ship, ordering damage control parties into the blazing hangar decks despite the obvious futility of their mission. The fires had reached the magazine spaces, and shortly after noon, a tremendous explosion lifted the carrier's bow section completely out of the water before the vessel settled by the stern and disappeared beneath the waves. 811 officers and men went down with their ship, taking with them decades of naval experience and expertise. Aboard the surviving carrier Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi prepared his own counterstrike against the American forces. His ship, operating independently several miles from the burning wrecks of her sisters, still possessed the capability to inflict significant damage on the enemy. Yamaguchi, considered one of Japan's finest naval tacticians, understood that his aircraft represented the Empire's last chance to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen Nagumo's force. The admiral's determination reflected the Japanese military philosophy that preferred death to dishonor, yet it also demonstrated a clear-eyed assessment of strategic realities. If the Hiryu could sink one or more American carriers, the battle might still be considered a tactical draw, preserving some measure of face for the Imperial Navy and potentially allowing for future operations against American positions in the Central Pacific. At 10:54 that morning, 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters lifted off from the Hiryu's flight deck in what would prove to be Japan's final offensive thrust of the battle. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led this desperate strike force toward the American carriers, knowing that his success or failure would determine whether Japan's Pacific offensive could continue or would end in the waters around Midway Atoll. The American carriers, having launched their own devastating attacks earlier that morning, now found themselves in the vulnerable position of recovering aircraft and preparing for potential counterstrikes. Aboard the Yorktown, damage control parties worked frantically to repair battle damage sustained during the Coral Sea engagement just weeks earlier. The carrier's engineering spaces hummed with activity as her crew prepared for whatever the Japanese might throw at them. Kobayashi's bombers, guided by reconnaissance aircraft that had shadowed the American task forces, found their targets shortly after noon. The Yorktown, distinguished by her island superstructure and flight deck configuration, became the focus of the Japanese attack. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire from both the carrier and her screening vessels, 3 bombs found their mark on the American flat top. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the ship's uptakes, temporarily knocking out her boilers and reducing her speed to 6 knots. The second bomb created a tremendous hole in the flight deck, while the third started fires in the rag storage compartments that threatened to spread throughout the vessel. For a moment, it appeared that Japan had achieved some measure of revenge for the morning's disasters. Military historians studying the battle, including those whose work appears in the proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute, note that the Yorktown's damage control procedures were among the finest ever demonstrated in naval combat. Yet American damage control expertise, honed through months of Pacific combat experience, proved superior to Japanese expectations. Within an hour, the Yorktown's engineering crews had restored power to her boilers, bringing her speed back up to 20 knots. The flight deck fires were extinguished, and temporary repairs allowed the carrier to resume limited flight operations. To Japanese reconnaissance aircraft observing from a distance, she appeared to be a different vessel entirely. This illusion prompted Admiral Yamaguchi to launch a second strike from the Hiryu, convinced that he was attacking a fresh American carrier rather than the same ship his first attack had damaged. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the morning's attack on Midway, lifted off from the Japanese carrier's deck in the early afternoon. Tominaga's aircraft found the Yorktown again, and this time their torpedo attack proved more successful. 2 fish struck the carrier's port side, flooding her engine rooms and bringing her to a complete stop. The vessel took on a dangerous list that threatened to capsize her entirely, forcing Captain Elliot Buckmaster to order abandon ship. As American sailors slid down lines into the Pacific swells, the Yorktown's fate seemed sealed, yet she would continue to play a role in the battle's final act through her own act of defiance against the Japanese Empire's ambitions. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Pacific battlefield, the surviving American forces prepared their final strike against the last operational Japanese carrier. The Hiryu, having launched 2 attacks against American forces, now faced the concentrated fury of dive bombers from both the Enterprise and the crippled Yorktown. Her destruction would complete the devastation of Japan's premier naval aviation force and effectively end the Empire's offensive capabilities in the Central Pacific. At 5:05 that evening, 24 dauntless dive bombers found the Hiryu attempting to escape toward the northwest. The Japanese carrier, alone and vulnerable after the destruction of her 3 sister ships, could not evade the determined American aviators, who dove through her defensive fire with the same precision that had destroyed the morning's targets. 4 direct hits transformed the flat top into another blazing monument to Japanese naval ambition. Admiral Yamaguchi, recognizing that his ship was doomed, chose to remain aboard the Hiryu rather than accept rescue. His decision reflected the samurai ethos that had sustained Japanese naval forces throughout their string of Pacific victories, yet it also symbolized the fundamental miscalculation that had brought the Imperial Navy to this moment of reckoning. The admiral's death, along with that of Captain Tomeo Kaku, who similarly chose to go down with his vessel, removed 2 of Japan's most experienced naval commanders from future operations. Strategic analyses conducted by post-war naval scholars, including those published by the Naval War College, consistently identify Midway as the decisive turning point that shifted Pacific War momentum permanently in favor of the United States. The human cost of Japan's defeat extended far beyond the loss of 4 fleet carriers and their escort vessels. Nearly 3,000 officers and men perished in the battle, including irreplaceable veteran pilots whose experience could not be quickly replaced. The Empire's carrier-based aviation capability, built up over 2 decades of careful development, was shattered in a single day's fighting. More critically, Japan's industrial capacity could not rapidly replace the specialized equipment and trained personnel lost at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster from his position aboard the battleship Yamato, faced the strategic reality that Japan's Pacific offensive had reached its high water mark. The plan to force American negotiation through decisive naval victory lay in ruins, alongside the burning hulks of his finest carriers. The Empire's defensive perimeter, stretched across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, would now face increasing American pressure without adequate naval aviation support. The morning of June 5th dawned over a transformed Pacific theater. American forces controlled Midway Atoll, their strategic position strengthened immeasurably by the previous day's victory. The Japanese fleet, shorn of its primary striking power, began its withdrawal toward home waters, carrying with it the recognition that the Empire's expansion had reached its zenith. Admiral Spruance, now commanding American forces after Fletcher's withdrawal, resisted the temptation to pursue the retreating Japanese force, understanding that his victory was complete and further risks were unnecessary. In the broader context of the Second World War, the Battle of Midway represented more than a tactical naval engagement. It marked the beginning of Japan's inevitable defeat. The Empire's inability to replace its losses, combined with America's growing industrial and military strength, ensured that future engagements would favor the United States. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years, yet its outcome was effectively decided in the waters around a tiny coral atoll, where Japan's Pacific posture crumbled under Midway's decisive strike.